So, dear colleagues, I'm happy to receive you here. When I was thinking about what you are doing here in our exhibition, but also in your work together, it reminded me of my art history studies, my courses at university, when we would sometimes spend 1 hour just in front of just one artwork. And in the beginning, I remember how I found this really tedious to slow down, even back then, I mean, more than 20 years back, of course. Already then, it made me rather impatient in the beginning. But then I got into the practice. So what did this do to us as a group of students back then and has influenced our lives? I think that on top of teaching us these techniques that we had to learn of describing the architecture or the art, etc., above all, I think it taught us actually to see. So I think that this has influenced my whole life, as even today my eyes can rest on beauty for a long, long time before getting bored. And even though the fast pace of life leaves little moments for it, it's always resourcing to pause and see. And in that sense, I think a piece of art is disadvantaged vis-à-vis a piece of music, because a piece of music is time-bound and takes its time to get to our ear. Slowness in front of a piece of music teaches us to listen, but we have to stay until it's over, whereas an artwork doesn't keep us in the first place. And while wine experts tell us that we should sip wine slowly and keep it a while in our mouth so that it develops its full taste, what could be nicer for touch than a slow dance? And in both cases, slow can mean more intense. And Nobel Peace Prize winner Daniel Kahneman has taught us that it takes the slow system or slow brain in order to allow for logical thinking, reflection, and weight decision-making. And so taking time allows us to use our senses, the senses I have mentioned and others, to the fullest. I would even say that taking time to use our senses to the fullest helps slowing down our lives. And therefore, I would like to thank you for helping us to slow down together and for having chosen our museum and our Presence of the Past exhibition. Many thanks, Simina, for making the contact in order to test some of your slow memory concepts. I would say, to conclude, that the title of our current temporary exhibition, Presence of the Past, takes on even more acute meaning through your work, because slowing down in the present to memorize the past seems to allow more presence of the past in the present. So I wish you all some very fruitful discussions, and at a time when time is so precious, thank you for dedicating even your slow time with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Constanze. That was our director, Constanze Itzel. I'm sorry for not making the introduction. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Simina Bădică. I'm a historian and curator here at the House of European History, and it is really my great pleasure to host a part of the Slow Memory Network and to give you the floor to explain also outside of the academic network what slow memory is. I will very briefly explain how this meeting happened and how come you are here. I would definitely say that it was love at first sight. So we had a very nice matchmaker, which is Dr. Groop Bădescu, who is here. So he just felt that this would be a nice match. Jenny Wüstenberg came here, and the Slow Memory Network organized a workshop in May. So the Presence of the Past exhibition was already open. This is an exhibition that, for those who have not seen it, I really invite you to stay for the full length of the event, because from 6 to 7 we would have this carte blanche guided tours by members of the network in the exhibition. So the exhibition is about, explores how Europeans engage with the past in their lives today outside of institutional settings. So we really wanted to get out of museum walls, of universities, academies, schools. So to see what the past means to people and how they reinterpret it, how they create it, how they reenact it, how they tear it down or build it up again. So this is the aim of the exhibition. And when the Slow Memory Network came here for a workshop, I think we very quickly realized that we have quite similar take on, first of all, what the role of memory in history, that it's not a footnote, it's not an afterthought of historical events, but it's deeply embedded in making history today, in making events. It's highly relevant in European societies. And also the way we work at the House of European History, it's something that I think matches these concepts and your manifesto, which, by the way, I invite everyone to look for, the Slow Memory Manifesto. It's on their website. It's really a nice invitation to not only to think of different topics, but to think differently about these topics. And this slow way of looking at things is also, I think, a part of how we do things at the House of European History. So we have these long terms of preparing exhibitions. Our exhibitions also take almost a year, so something between 9, 10, 11 months, which also allows for things like this to happen. So if our exhibition would have been 3 months, let's say, then this would never be possible, because we would just have a space open for visitors where visitors would come, but there would never be time to develop something in the exhibition. And one of the reasons we are here today is that after the workshop in May, the members of the network really wanted to give something to the visitors of the Presence of the Past exhibition, which is the slow memory lens. So they developed some activity sheets which are now in the exhibition and which will remain in the exhibition, which help visitors view the exhibitions through the slow memory lens. And I think that's a great partnership and a great collaboration. And especially, I just want to mention one particular activity that they created, because it's an activity in one of the spaces of the exhibition that is already created by the visitors. We have a wall, a scratchable wall, which was completely black at the beginning of the exhibition, and the visitors were invited to scratch on the wall to whom or to what they would build a monument. And now this whole wall looks like a marvelous piece of art. So there are a lot of visitors who just think that we commissioned an artist to do this. It really looks great. And it's full of thoughts and ideas and controversial things and concepts and people, things that move people in 2025. So I think it's a nice also radiography of what we think is worth commemorating today. And the activity that is proposed in the slow memory activity sheets is looking at this wall and looking for specific things. I will not tell it to you now, but it's like a bingo card to look for things that you agree with, things that you don't agree with, things, a martyr, a hero, an artist. So really it invites visitors to look closely at what other visitors have done. So I think that's already a next level of co-creation and participation in exhibitions, and it would not have been possible without the Slow Memory Network and without this long term in which we do things and have the time to sit and think and see how they develop. So that was just my brief introduction and teaser for what is going on from 6 p.m. on. And now I will give the floor to Jenny Wüstenberg to actually explain to us what this slow memory is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simina, and thank you, Constanze, and just a big thank you for welcoming us into your space, not only today but also for the workshop. I mean, it was really a very creative and flexible process, and I think I can speak for all of us that we kept learning with you as we were learning about your exhibition, and also today we got a tour of the permanent exhibition. And it's just been a wonderful collaboration. I also want to thank Stephanie in addition, Stephanie Gonzalez, who is on parental leave, I think, but she was also part of the workshop, so make sure to include her. And the insights that we're discussing today, they, as Simina already said, emerged from our project on slow memory, which was funded by a cost action. And I don't know how many of you know what a cost action is, or whether we might even have colleagues from the Cost Association, which is also based in Brussels here today. But I just wanted to take the opportunity to also thank the Cost Association, because we're almost at the end of our 4-year project, and it's really been a fantastic way to work together. Because it's a kind of funding that allows you to bring people together from all kinds of different countries and disciplines, and to really work together for 4 years on a joint challenge. So we went into the project not really knowing what slow memory is. I'm not sure we really know 100% yet. It's kind of a live concept that keeps emerging and growing. But we really took full advantage of this funding. We had lots of meetings in really interesting places, and always made sure to really take time to get to know the place we were in, to meet with local academics and activists and people who were active in that space in remembering. And it resulted in a huge amount of research, which I have to say I'm very proud of, but also in lots of partnerships and a lot of friendships as well. So it's just been, on a personal level, very, very rewarding, but also, I think, very successful in terms of its academic achievements, but also working beyond academia, as this collaboration very much shows. So I also want to thank my colleagues, some of whom are on stage and some are in the audience, and then many, many are not here today, but it's being recorded so they can watch later. And I also wanted to thank, I don't think Flavia and Rosella made it today, but they're based in Brussels, and just a shout out to them, because this Cost Association is a big organization, and each of those people have a lot of actions that they take care of, but they actually really work with you personally. So I think it's quite an unusual institution. So with that, I will briefly try to introduce you to the project and the concept, which you will see why it's challenging, because it's so multifaceted, and my colleagues will obviously color in the lines with their own research and their own ideas. So just to give you an idea of what we have done, what kind of project this has been. So we really have people from many, many different countries, including in the core leadership team, which was a fantastic team. And we had meetings in all these different countries. And there you see a list of our outputs. I'm not going to read them out, but I really like that Constanze started with different senses, because we actually have outputs for all different senses. Maybe not all, but most of our senses. Certainly the eyes, through obviously our publications, but also our virtual exhibition, which we're going to show you a little bit at the end. And we have a podcast, which you can listen to, so that's for your ears. And Simina already mentioned that we have a manifesto, which is kind of a little bit of a utopian, imagining what we would really like to work like, which I don't think applies only to academia, but beyond. And we have a podcast episode about that, so you don't even have to read it, you can listen to it, including in different languages. And we even made a cookbook. So you can try out our slow recipes, and you can listen to our slow Spotify playlist. So there's something for everybody. But we also produce lots of conventional academic output. So what is slow memory and what is slow memory studies? Again, it's a live concept, but I think we've sort of agreed on a few things. So we're thinking about slow memory in kind of 3 entangled areas. The first is that we feel like we need theories and concepts that can attend to slow developments or gradual developments. And slow, by this, we don't just mean this as a temporal adjective, of slow speed, but it's kind of a shorthand for developments that can be gradual, unspectacular, without a clear beginning or end, maybe not a clear place or multiple places, or seemingly agentless. So they're developments that are hard to pin down, and that we often miss when we talk about memory politics conventionally. The second thing is that we think that we need to study, and maybe some of us also want to engage in memory practices that can happen at different tempos. So we're not necessarily just interested in the slow, but the slow memory practices that have been going on, forever, are often missed by our discipline. So I'm thinking, quilt making, oral traditions that go through generations, and all kinds of practices that, we're not reinventing the wheel, but we think that we need to pay more attention to. And then the third area that we want to focus on is doing memory studies or any academic research, or really anything, with less time pressure. And this, maybe unsurprisingly, has been probably the most popular part of our action, and maybe why we grew so rapidly, because everybody was like, oh, yes, we want that. And it's been really interesting talking about how we can do that when we all, of course, have constraints, including from the project that we were doing, where, as you just saw, we had to produce a lot of deliverables. But again, our manifesto talks about this, and so I invite you to check that out. So memory studies, sort of conventionally, is about understanding how the past is made meaningful in the present. And it has really helped us to think about how things like war and genocide and revolutions and these sort of sudden extreme events shape our identities. So this is what we tend to set in stone, right? But because of this, memory studies tend to have sort of a bias towards these eventful things. And every modern state, and of course also the European Union, now recognizes the importance of these practices and has an arsenal of policy instruments to address them and to shape them. And one of the implicit assumptions, sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit assumptions of these policies is somehow the past will save us, right? Somehow the past will help us do better in the future and shape our behavior in certain ways. So that's obviously an empirical question, whether we believe that really works. But let's assume for a moment that there's some truth to that, and I think many of us would like to believe that. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be engaged in this field or in museums. So our focus on the slow today might be seem like a bit of a contradiction, right? Because we all feel like we're living in these times of acceleration, especially since 2020 with the monument protests and COVID and the sort of immediate commemorative response to COVID, while the pandemic was still happening. Whoops. So this acceleration of memory politics has really highlighted the grassroots memory practices, and in many ways it was an important shift, right? Because we dismantled a lot of long-established and problematic memorial narratives. However, these protests didn't, they in a way reinforced our focus on events, right? Because often when we tore down a monument, we often replaced it with someone else, right? We sort of replaced like for like. And so one of the things we were talking about is that we tend to, we had an important shift in the content of our memory culture, but not necessarily in the frameworks that we use. So in other words, what we're interested in with slow memory is, if memory is supposed to help us make sense of the past in the present, how do we do this with slow things, right? What kinds of memory practices do we need to make sense of slow pasts? And this, I think, is not just an intellectual problem, but it's really a practical one. Because if the past is slow, when the slowness of the change that we're interested in is even harder to address in 24-hour news cycles and election cycles, how can we learn from it? So this slow memory problem is really a fundamental policy problem in an era of ecological emergency and of democratic crisis. So, in a nutshell, slow memory addresses developments that take effect over a long period of time or are seemingly eventless. Slow memory promotes long-term, deliberative, and inclusive approaches to dealing with history, ensuring reflection, right, and addressing some of these important challenges that we might miss when we only look at the eventful. And slow memory also means, for me, taking into account not just these big questions of, large-scale change and deep time and so on, but how these interact with contemporary human struggles and experience. Right? So the challenge is kind of to bridge that gap between time frames of what we are trying to remember, the slow, and the way in which we operate in our current remembrance and meaning-making and even political and economic practices. So we hope that this is kind of useful for all kinds of different topics that you might be interested in. And then we have lots of different examples of how people have used these concepts. And so I will now hand over to, who am I handing over to? Katerina. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny. My name is Katerina Kralova, and I'm a full professor in contemporary history at the Charles University in Prague. I have been with the project for long, slow, sometimes very quick, and in the 10 years. And it was very interesting to see the working group I was engaged in on welfare to develop towards care. And I will share for all of us who have been working on many issues some of our ideas and findings. What we were doing was trying to rethink institutionalized, or if you wish, community social care. So what we were thinking that for children, the elderly, chronically ill, institutionalized care, social care in general, over a long time, enjoys very bad reputation, linked to abuse and not nurturing structures. Instead, family care, foster care, and adoption placements are perceived as superior policy choices across cultures and in historical collective memory. Historical research conducted as part of the Slow Memory Working Group on Welfare, which was the group I was active in India, Ireland, UK, Argentina, Spain, and Czechia, showcases that institutional care needs to be rethought as complementary to family-based care. Topical issue right now, right? With aging population and accompanied refugee children fleeing conflicts without parents, but also lesson learned from our case studies on, for example, chronic diseases, Alzheimer, schizophrenia, and Greek Civil War refugee children coming to Czechoslovakia in the 40s and staying until today with the next generations to come. Through our research, we wish to raise awareness about the varieties of institutionalized care and the experience of it, which are often framed around a sense of community and positive relationships with peers and educators. We also wish to rethink institutionalized social care as complementary to other policy options, such as home care and foster care, which can be dragging and sometimes as violent as the worst examples of institutionalized care. We argue that a hybrid approach to social care is more cost-efficient as well as nourishing to the beneficiaries in a long run. Institutionalized care in our view, can be used and useful and effective solution to education and socialization of marginalized communities in need of care, such as children, elderly, chronically ill. And this is then happening not just in short session with psychologists or therapists, which are not available, but in a longer process, which slow memory is promoting. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. So my name is Sara Jones. I'm a professor in languages, cultures and societies at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And I was one of the co-chairs of Working Group 3 of the Action, which was the working group on the transformation of politics. So I'm going to talk today very much about a specific case study that I have started thinking about. So some of the ideas might not be completely fully formed, but I wanted to share it with you because I think it does have some policy relevance. So when we've been thinking about slow memory in our working group, and in particular in a paper that I co-wrote with Thomas van der Putte, we thought about part of the past becoming a kind of slow, eventless, unspoken, unvoiced past is its ability to become a cultural trope that attaches to many meanings and concepts. And one of the examples that we looked at, that Thomas looked at in particular, was Holocaust memory, particularly as it's used outside of the European context. We've also, in our working group, thought about something we're calling slow commemoration, particularly in relation to International Women's Day, so the 8th of March, where there is a historic event that this relates to, but that event generally isn't remembered, and International Women's Day attaches to multiple meanings. So in the Soviet context, it was about socialist emancipation, which is often then denigrated in the post-Soviet context. Some places it's about Mother's Day. In the UK, it's principally about commercialization and selling you pink things. And in other places, it's very much a kind of fight still against gender-based violence or other kinds of discrimination. So I've started to think about this in the political context as well. So thinking about how the past is being used in UK political discourse about the Ukraine war and Ukrainian refugees in the UK as well. As I said, my ideas are a little fresh, but I just wanted to present you with a couple of things that I found in this debate in the UK Parliament on the 27th of February, on the 3-year anniversary of the full-scale invasion. And what we see are references to multiple pasts across political parties. So this isn't a particular political part of the political spectrum. So firstly, the Second World War is a frequent reference, and it's generally relating to freedom, democracy, human rights, and heroism. So you can see the quotation on the slide there, which I won't read them all out, but essentially, yes, that we need to continue to fight or to support Ukraine because this is about 80 years of democracy and freedom in the UK, in Europe, and the UK has always stood for that, etc., that kind of discourse. Another narrative is around the Cold War, and this is where a couple of things. One is Russian expansionism is seen as something that's almost eternal, but also rules-based order and how the UK has a duty to keep that rules-based international order. But also, and particularly in this context of February this year, the idea that America has a duty in Europe as well. So harking back to the Cold War for that. I'm going to talk about these a little bit more. So this is interesting because we see here two quite divergent and diametrically opposed uses of the past here. So firstly, this is a Northern Irish MP from the DUP who refers to the Northern Ireland Troubles in his discourse about Ukraine and particularly about the need for transitional justice. So here, the IRA are positioned as Russia. So he said, in Northern Ireland, we dealt with the bare face of evil for too many years, We saw hatred overcome basic humanity as mothers and children were blown to pieces in a fish shop on a Saturday afternoon by Irish Republican terrorists. It grieves me that the face of evil is still at work and that such atrocities and disregard for human life for women and children have been replicated in Ukraine. On the other hand, this Labour MP, Jazz Athwal, flips that script and talks about Ukraine in reference to colonialism. And here, Russia is the colonialist, the imperial state, and therefore is the British state, a British colonial state. So she says, like many of my constituents, I was born in India, and my parents lived most of their lives in India and what is now Pakistan. My family, my neighbours, and the people of Ilford South well understand the consequences of imperialism, the scars left by wars of aggression, the theft of agency and denial of self-determination, which is why, when the invasion began, thousands of local people in Ilford stood with Ukraine and donated so much that we had to hire vans and appeal for additional drivers to get the donations to the border. So I think what's interesting here is this past-present nexus, where both the past and present become unstable and multiple. So the war in Ukraine is referring to multiple things: freedom and democracy, rules-based order, terrorism, imperialism. It comes to refer to those to make current political statements. It's often in reference to events, so in that sense doesn't seem slow, but I think this emptying of content makes me think that it does have these slow elements. So in some ways it seems both fast, like shorthand, but also quite slow. And I think that we need to kind of slow down and reflect on that as well, because it's making the use of the past quite powerful in the sense that it's got these multiple meanings, but it also risks emptying it of its specificity and its content. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Reynolds, and I'm a professor of history and memory studies at Nottingham Trent University. I've also been with this project from the outset, and it's been a great pleasure, I must say. I co-led Working Group 4, which is focused on the transformation of conflict. And as you may have guessed from my accent, I'm from Northern Ireland. And the central focus of one strand of my research is on dealing with the legacy of the conflict in Northern Ireland. So I should push this on. This way. So in many respects, the Slow Memory Project came along at the kind of intersection of ongoing work that I've been doing for some time. And as ever in this project, I now have to tell you something interesting quickly, despite focusing on the slow. So I think I've been very fortunate in that the work that I've been doing has been slow, and the development of the slow concept has helped me make sense of my work, but also then apply it to the real world, if you will. So without giving you too much context, my work very much intervenes in the debate around the post-conflict circumstances in Northern Ireland, which is obviously very, very complex and very much ongoing. It's a peace process because the peace is in process. Very successful peace process, it could be argued. Nevertheless, many challenges still to be overcome. And perhaps one of the most pressing challenges is that which is to do with how do we deal with legacy? How do we deal with the past? How do we talk about the past? How do we educate about the past? How do we represent the past in our museums, for example? Now, in the early days of the peace process, this was a subject which was kind of avoided because it was so sensitive. But as the peace process has matured, there has been a growing consensus that we need to confront this issue head on. And since around 2014, there have been quite a lot of government initiatives, policy initiatives, to look at some sort of strategic approach to dealing with the conflict. I would argue that the majority of these have been unsuccessful, and we're at somewhat of an impasse, precisely because they're top-down. And you could argue that they're fast initiatives when it comes to dealing with the past. And let me just give you one example. In 2023, the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson approved legislation on legacy, which, amongst a range of things, provided for an amnesty for anybody who was involved in committing crimes during the conflict. This was very much a fast approach to dealing with the Troubles. Now, there are not many things that people agree on in Northern Ireland. And when it comes to legacy, there are even fewer people that agree on them. But everybody in Northern Ireland agreed that this fast approach was not going to cut it. And therefore, in my research, what I've been trying to demonstrate, and in particular via the two examples on the screen here, Voices of 68 and Voices of 74, are two projects which very much deploy an approach that is increasingly grounded in the slow, particularly because they deploy oral history as their core methodological approach, but also they draw on a theory of agonistic memory, which basically says we don't have to agree about the past to talk about the past. So for 68, I was doing slow without realizing it, and then the slow came along and has been very much explicitly folded in to Voices of 74. And as I work towards the next stage in this research, I'm very confident that the slow will feature very heavily as we continue this work. And from a policy perspective, some of you will know that just last week, the current British government decided to rip up the previous legislation and put in place new legislation to deal with legacy. And I'm very happy to say that I believe that this approach will move away from that previous fast approach, which simply will not work, and will draw on a slower, more considered approach. And I can say that with some confidence because I myself have been invited to some policy discussions with those people who are forming those policies based on the work which I believe is grounded in the slow. So I do believe that there's great potential in the slow for dealing with those contexts where there are very difficult conversations to be had about the legacy of the past. Thank you.
That's more like it. Hello, everybody. My name is Kim Groop, and I'm representing Working Group 3, Changes in Politics, from Finland. And I'm a church historian and historian. And my take on a political theme would be on slow memory and religion. And so we're talking about slow transitions between different ways of thinking and believing, going back very long. And as the president of Finland, Alexander Stubb, would do, I will give you 3 examples. Okay, first, and as you see on the slide here, it is on the Christianization of the Roman Empire in the 4th century. Now, you all remember Constantine the Great, the man who accepted Christianity and turned the Roman Empire into a Christian empire. Or if he did it, it can be debated. Now, when the Christians became accepted after long periods of persecution, a lot of things changed, of course. Christianity became slowly a world religion. All of this didn't happen in a vacuum. There were Jews in the Roman Empire, and they had their freedom. Now, the Christians from the very beginning went to these Jews, but gradually, when we come to the 4th century, very few of these Christians were Jews. They were just people, from the neighborhood. But what they did is that they took on the Jewish traditions. They continued them as if they were their own. So it happened that they would regard themselves, not the Jews, as God's chosen people. So it happened that the Exodus would no longer so strongly be about the Jews leaving Egypt, but it would happen to be the Christians leaving persecutions. And the churches that they built were essentially a continuation of the synagogues that had been built by Jews all the way from 70 in our time counting when the second temple in Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jews themselves had to move out. So Christianity was kind of a continuation of a Jewish thing with deep traditions, deep legacy, and very long centuries of wealth that the Christians then would see as their own. And as you see on this image, there were not only synagogues that became a model for churches in the 4th century and the following centuries, but also pre-Christian temples, as the one here in Carcere in northern Italy, where you see the palimpsestic structure of the side, where the old and the new blend, carrying the old into the future and perhaps preserving it also. Now, my second example, speaking of palimpsests and churches and so on, it would be, I would take you to Finland, my country, and Sweden, when Christianity came to our places, around 1000, take or leave a few years, we see an astonishing slow transformation in our churches, in our cemeteries, and generally in medieval buildings. For centuries, people when they were buried, for very long times, that is, were buried in both, pre-Christian ways and in Christian ways, carrying their weapons and carrying crosses, being some buried northwest, north, south, and more increasingly east-west, to get the best of both worlds, carrying the past into the future. Another thing, and we have to change slide so you know what I'm talking about. Another thing is perkele, which is the most common Finnish swear word. Now, perkele was actually a pre-Christian thunderstorm god from the Norse tradition or pantheon. And when Christianity came, he was adopted. He was written into the Gospels. So it happened that it was Perkele who tempted, this pre-Christian Norse god who tempted Jesus in the desert. I find that, but also through our swearing with Perkele today, he has survived, and I find that to be a quite funny, event, a funny thing. We have also surprisingly many really old medieval simplistic paintings in our churches, which depict not Christian art, but they are ordinary things that rich people did, with horses, riding on horses, things that poorer people did and brought with them into the future, that have, speaking about palimpsests, have been sometimes painted over. At other times, they have been taken back. And in most cases, we now have them, as far as I know. Thirdly, my third example is to take us to today, fast forward. We have a similar slow transition where we are surrounded by churches and religious traditions that we may no longer feel that we are a part of or that we need, but which we relate to and which we somehow want to preserve. And it was like the German musician and author Bernd Lutz Lange once wrote, quote, "What would an atheist be without his Christmas Ontario?" End of quote, referring to how important Handel and Johann Sebastian Bach have continued to be to us, though they clearly present the birth and death of Christ, which we may not so strongly relate to. So we continue to be guided by our Christian past in the form of calendars and holidays, of architecture, music, art, ethics, and so on. This is my take on slow memory and religion, on traditions and customs that we may have left behind, but many of which still tend to stay with us, comfortably receded into the background, or remaining as grooves in the cultural landscape, pleasant but somehow so familiar to walk on. Thank you.
Okay, you're getting a real smorgasbord of topics here, so I'm going to move you from Christianity to climate change, so just bear with me. I'm Lucy Bond. I'm a reader in Literature and Memory Studies at the University of Westminster, and I've been co-chair of Working Group 5, which looks at the transformation of the environment. I've got one of my former co-chairs, Steph Krapps, here in the audience as well. And the project I'm going to talk about is a project I've been working on for the last, it feels like forever, 7 years or so, with my great friend and colleague Jessica Rapson, who's the other co-chair of Working Group 5. What we've looked at in Working Group 5 are ways of rethinking the methods and frames through which we perceive environmental transformation. And in particular, what we've been looking at are ways to challenge dominant understandings of environmental change or environmental disaster as being spectacular, event-based, and clearly delimited in time and space. So all those conceptual coordinates that Jenny brought up at the start. And in doing this, our work advances three kind of central claims. Firstly, that we need to think about ecological and social injustice as being fundamentally connected. We need to refuse the kind of centuries-old separation of nature and culture that comes out of Enlightenment thought. Secondly, that we need to think more about the intersection between historical and contemporary forms of violence and injustice. And thirdly, that we need to acknowledge the ways in which spectacular environmental phenomena, so things like hurricanes or floods, may be linked to invisible or more intangible forms of slow destruction. So there are real questions of scale here, of how we think about events and or processes that take place over years, decades, or centuries, or take place over state lines, nation lines, continental lines even. So how do we both scale up and scale down our imagination at the same time? So in order to unpack these questions, I'm going to look very briefly at a case study that may be familiar to you, which is Louisiana's Gulf Coast, which is the region that Jess and I have been focusing on for the last few years. This is a map of what is known as the River Road in Louisiana. It runs from New Orleans in the east to Baton Rouge in the west. It's about 80 miles long. And the top map, which is slightly blurry here, I apologise, is taken from 1853, so in the decade before the American Civil War. And what those colourful lines are plantations. Plantations of indigo, sugar, cotton, tobacco, rice, all of them farmed and cultivated by enslaved labour. So this is a scene of historic violence. What the bottom map shows you is exactly the same area today. This is a map that's been produced by an activist network, the Louisiana Environmental Action Network. And all of those circles delineate toxic sites, so that's the yellow circles, petrochemical plants, that's the red circles, or displaced or at-risk communities. So the landscape of the plantation past has seamlessly been replaced by the landscape of the petrochemical present. There's an even more intimate connection here. So in the 1960s, much of the land along the River Road was sold to petrochemical companies looking to develop massive refineries because the same needs that fed the plantation agriculture, so access to water, big spaces, access to certain minerals, also feeds the petrochemical culture of today. The other thing to bear in mind is that the communities down this road are between 80 and 99% African American, many of them living on land that was given to their ancestors at emancipation. So today what you see is a toxic petrochemical infrastructure that is poisoning African American communities whose ancestors were enslaved on the very same land that their descendants now live on. So there is here that direct correlation between historic and contemporary violence that I was talking about at the start, but also between environmental and social forms of injustice, all being played out across this landscape. To expand our gaze a little bit further, if you move back from the River Road about 100 miles, you hit the Gulf of Mexico, very much not the Gulf of America. Between the River Road and the Gulf of Mexico is a landscape of 10,000 miles of petrochemical pipelines. And you can see that in that top photograph there. So these pipelines have been dredged through wetlands, starving them of soil and increasing erosion. What that has meant is that the land of southeast Louisiana is disappearing very quickly. So I can't quite see what the top date of that top map, I think it's 1839, the bottom map's from 2020. And you can see just how extreme the erosion is in this area as this coastal landscape has been turned to open water. This in turn has fed another sort of phenomenon of environmental racism as the indigenous and Cajun communities who depend on this landscape for fishing and for agriculture, and who have done for centuries, have been displaced. However, this kind of disappearance of the wetlands is very rarely talked about because it's also been displaced in the cultural imagination by the much more visible form of violence to have attacked this coastline in recent years, which are multiple hurricanes from Hurricane Katrina up to Hurricane Ida, and also, of course, the big oil spill of Deepwater Horizon in 2010. So you see here spectacular forms of violence or disaster displacing a very quiet but very real and very tangible erosion of this landscape. So that's how this project speaks to those kind of three coordinates that I mentioned at the start. The need to connect social and ecological violence, the need to think about the connection between historic and contemporary injustice, and the need to think about the ways in which spectacular fast violence is connected to slow processes of destruction. And just to think very quickly about what that might mean in terms of policy, what we're arguing is that we need to integrate the idea of slow memory much more into policy debates in order to sort of set out the kind of arguments that I've been making here. That we need to build more capacity culturally for slow environmental work that is embedded in communities and grassroots initiatives, and that we very much need quite urgently now to counteract short-term thinking in environmental governance and to be aware that governmental processes need to take account of these kind of longer-term accretive processes. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vjollca Krasniqi. I'm a professor of sociology and gender studies at the University of Prishtina in Kosovo. In the slow memory team, Cost Action, I had the privilege and very happy to have been able to be the chair of the working group for training and capacity building. I'm going to present today a few insights or key insights from research that explores how slow memory can transform capacity building and policy making in the cultural and remembrance. So the research begins by recognizing memory not as a fixed record, but as an ongoing, contested process. Conventional memory practices often prioritize speed, top-down narratives, or dominant perspectives, approaches that frequently or very often, or most of the times in specific locations and contexts, marginalize certain groups, and especially they marginalize women, marginalize children, and also groups, social groups who come from very disadvantaged social backgrounds. In contrast, slow memory emphasizes community-led, participatory, and place-based practices of remembering. Importantly, it foregrounds epistemic justice, ensuring that historically marginalized voices, including women, gender minorities, and other overlooked groups, actively shape collective memory. This approach draws on the idea of situated knowledges from the feminist theorists and feminist scholarship, recognizing that knowledge is always produced from specific social, cultural, and embodied positions. By acknowledging these perspectives, slow memory challenges dominant narratives and allows for more nuanced, locally grounded understanding of the past. To put this into practice in our research in the Working Group 6 and also in the text that I've been working with the colleague, the co-chair of the Working Group 6 with Isabel from Portugal, we have kind of came with a framework on how to look from the perspective of slow memory and training and capacity building, and the framework of what we have thought as 4Ds. And let me explain what these 4Ds stand for. So first is decentering, which shifts attention away from dominant narratives and opens up space for historically excluded memories, historically excluded also communities in articulating historical events, in articulating also what the past stands for. Second, D is deepening, which engages with complexity, with ethical dimensions, and lived realities of memory, including the gendered experiences of violence, caregiving, and labor that are absent very often from memory, policy, and also from official accounts. Third, democratization, which empowers communities as equal partners, giving women and gender minorities a voice in shaping how histories are remembered, but also how histories are interpreted, and how the space to imagine the future is evolving and open to them. And the fourth is duration, which stresses long-term, and I think Jenny started with a frame of slow memory on the importance of the long-term ethical and sustained engagement rather than one and off interventions. Together, these principles provide a framework for collaborative, inclusive, and transformative memory work. So the key argument is that slow memory counters the limitations of fast, bureaucratic approaches to memory policy. And by embracing the 4Ds, institutions can create reflective, inclusive, and sustained practices that empower communities, resist the commodification of memory, and make room for dialogue and contestation. Recognizing situated knowledges ensures that memory work is grounded in lived realities, especially those of marginalized groups. In conclusion, the research calls for a shift from remembrance as ritual toward remembrance of everyday resistance and transformation. And by slowing down and centering lived experience, including gendered and situated perspectives, we enable communities to actively shape the narratives that define their past, present, and future. Slow memory, therefore, is not just a concept, it is a practice that bridges historical awareness with justice, with equity, and empowerment, ensuring all voices have the opportunity to contribute to collective memory. Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers, and for, I think, keeping it quite brief and short and entertaining and jumping from one topic to the other. But I think it gave a nice overview of all the very different themes that your research network was involved with. So I think there is some time for discussion now. So I will take questions from the audience to whoever of the speakers here, but also, as Jenny mentioned, there are also other members of the Slow Memory Network among us, infiltrated. So maybe I will not necessarily give the microphone directly. I mean, I will ask you, whoever wants to to reflect on the questions, because I think many of you are involved in like intersected themes and ways of thinking about it. So I would immediately open the floor. Does anyone have an immediate question now? Was it understandable what they have been doing for 4 years? If not, I also have a very personal question, because I've been meeting. So I was not part of this network. I really joined just at the end. So I was really curious, who was the first, or how was it the first time when someone said slow memory? So who was that person? How did it come up? How did other people react? Is there a story about that?
There is a story.
You would have to use the mic. I think I keep. Do we have enough? Or yes.
Yeah. So the story is, it's not a single person that first said the words. It really was a collaborative process of coming to this concept. So we started talking, and by we I mean a bunch of us, some of the people here, but also a few people who aren't here today. I think we pretty much knew each other in the context of the Memory Studies Association, but we started talking about the fact that, you know, some of what I said at the beginning, that we felt like memory studies wasn't very good at grasping some of the processes that and historical developments that we thought were important, the slow things. But we didn't really have a word for it right away. So we had several workshops in early 2020. And I remember coming back from Paris, where we had a workshop hosted by Sara in Paris. And I remember coming back and thinking, should I be wearing a mask or not? So it was already, you know, in the air, literally. At that workshop in Paris, I think it was because we were trying to find an acronym, and we were trying to figure out a nifty word that we could use for a grant application. And in the end, we didn't use this as an acronym, but we realized that the slow was kind of what that brought together all the things we were interested in. So it was that group that developed that focus. And then the pandemic hit, and it took us many more months than we thought it would to develop it. But I think actually the pandemic allowed us to consider a little bit longer, because they extended the deadline for the grant. And so we had a little bit more time, and in a very weird situation, right, ended up writing it all up virtually. So we no longer saw I think the next time we saw each other was in 2022, when we were really all able to travel again. So it's not, we don't have a hero who came up with the word.
Yes, maybe we have someone is ready with a question. I'm afraid I have to circulate the microphone, and that is because we are recording this session. So I hope everyone is okay with this, or at least your voices will be heard, because the video is only on the scene. But
so I'm very bad at holding microphones. I hope it's at the right distance. So
would you also please introduce yourselves, everyone?
So my name is Wawrzyniak. I'm a master's student at KU Leuven in international politics, and I'm very interested in memory politics. It's my favorite subject of all time. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you about the community care research, and first and foremost, in which country it was developed in, like where was the research done?
Am I there? Yes. Thank you very much for your question. It started with several of us being interested in different ways of community care. So while a colleague in Spain was looking at Alzheimer care at home, another colleague was looking at asylum houses in the UK. Another colleague was working on schizophrenia in Ireland. Another colleague was working on vulnerable people, on chronic diseases, and people suffering from environmental disasters in India. Another one was looking at contemporary children, displaced, vulnerable, without care, coming to communities in Argentina. And my piece was the one on Czechoslovakia and on children who are now adults or are no longer with us, but spent what they expected will be a few months or maybe a year in children homes, or what would be called in other days orphanages, over years without really seeing their parents, and yet giving us testimonies about creating communities and relying on their communities later on. So we came, each of us, with very separate topic. And it was very interesting to observe that, be it chronic diseases, be it children or elderly, be it people of any gender, that the community they created was something like a second family, or maybe something like a first family in a way. And the creative ways which were prepared for them in that sort of community care, sometimes taking over months, sometimes taking over years, were shaping who they are today. We are not saying it's a universal model, but we started to think about how community is sometimes missing from what is becoming too individualized, with all of us overworked and not having the professional mentoring for what we are doing. I hope it answered your question.
That's sort of what I was hinting towards as well, because as I have been discussing community care with people from my university, I remember a friend from Finland mentioning that in Finland there is quite little community care because people really trust institutions. So then people don't need to take care of one another because the institutions are there to take care of them. And I wanted to ask you whether you noticed any interesting or really forward trends between cultures, maybe between the global north, the global south, or just more Western and Eastern Europe.
Of course, we were not able to cover every culture, and just maybe from my observation, sharing the post-Cold War Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic / Slovakia, where things became very individualized. I thought that this regime change may have been something which brought us into abandoning some community things because they had the stigma of being communist, indoctrinated, and so on. But then you open a discussion with your colleague in UK, and you see that they feel similarly about both the Thatcherists and the socialists or whoever opposing the Thatcherism, sort of promoting personalized care and abandoning the community care. And then you have, Spain, which went through many dictatorships, and you do see something similar. So very often it feels like, at least from Central Europe, that they would be communities on religious grounds or on bigger families or whatever, which would promote community care more. But what we saw from India to Argentina, from Spain to UK and Czechoslovakia, it was like so many moments in the post-war war toward that in fact, regardless of religion or size of families or traditions, we're slowly through the process going into the more individualized care. And we were thinking we have to look into how to do that better.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. Are there any more questions that I can pick up from the audience? I think we can have a round here because then we really need to wrap up by 5:30. So, okay. Christine?
Yes, so my name is Christine Dupont. I'm a historian and a curator here in the House of European History. So a colleague of Simina who spoke us a lot, you can believe, about slow memory. Even though I've not been reading your findings yet, but I will because it's really fascinating. It's for me a very long time. I'm not hearing about such a high-level research which so much resonates with society and what we have to deal with as citizens, I would say. And my question would be, how do you give back this research to the communities that are at the center of what you are doing? It was very clear from all of your presentations that it's about people. So I've seen that you have podcasts, you have things, but is it enough? How is it working? And really, how does it goes back to the communities? Because I think that's very important.
I can perhaps share one example. So it's true that it's one of the fascinating things about this project has been the fact that we have been able to engage with stakeholders at a very early stage. We've mentioned a few times the necessity to move away from that top-down approach and consider slowing down, which in part means engaging with people at community level in our activities. But instead of going to those people at the end of our projects, actually bringing them in to the projects from the outset. So I have a particular project at the moment which is engaging with a group of young people in Northern Ireland who are outside of formal education and who have been asked to reflect on their opinions of legacy. Because if we're going to deal with the past properly, then we need to engage ordinary people, and particularly young people. I think, young people are the kind of the future custodians of peace in post-conflict societies. So I introduced the concept of oral history, slow memory, and even trained them as oral historians to go and do their own oral histories with their families, and then bring those findings back and present them in a museum. And then we negotiated with them about, what was it like to engage in that process. And it wasn't as much the outputs that they produced, it was the process that counted. So it was the conversations that it facilitated. So I think if we are going to translate this sort of work into real change, then we need to engage with our stakeholders as contributors, as collaborators, rather than users or receivers of what we do. That's just my example.
I think I'll just echo what Chris has said, but slightly add to that one of the fantastic things about engaging so closely with this project has been that the slow has crept into everything that I've done, even if it hasn't necessarily been slow memory research to start with. And one example is a project that I delivered with Citizens UK, which is a kind of citizens organisation in the UK, as the name would suggest. They kind of train citizen leaders to deliver different types of projects. And they wanted to do something around migration myth-busting for reasons that I think are probably clear. And one of the things I did was work with them firstly to make it delivered and led by the community leaders that we helped. I don't even say we trained them, we co-designed the project with them and they delivered it. But also embedding those slow approaches of storytelling and value sharing into these myth-busting briefings rather than have it be, these are the reasons that you're wrong, which we know doesn't really work. Yeah.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say, as well as the podcast, there's a whole series of educational resources on the website, which is another way of trying to involve as many people as possible, whether it's teachers, individuals, community groups, to get involved with all the different strands we've been working on.
Thank you. Oh, okay. Now, so I think what we would do, maybe we get these 3 questions and then we wrap up. Is that fine? Or 4 even, okay.
Okay, I will try to be fast. Hope that's allowed. Alexander Matei is my name, and I will focus for the word future from that long sentence. I come from different backgrounds, so I might mess up a bit of things here. But what I want to ask is, like, we live in a world of multiple crises, in a world of exponential change and accelerated change. And how do we manage to balance slow reflections with the need sometimes for fast decisions, fast solutions? Because otherwise it's a luxury to have time to research, I'm sure, but reality tells us things are very complex. And I give you an example from a totally different field. I've been yesterday for another event talking to two different topics, but basically we observe that we are depending on American software, Chinese industry, for example, and we frame discussion about how we get on them, how we tackle a problem. And by the way, we put the foundation and we go to it, artificial intelligence is already so fast that it basically changed the context. So a bigger wicked problem. So how do we balance soul reflection with fast decision? And
Yes, this has been extremely inspiring. I think the 4D we will also use in museum practice. Thank you all very much. I guess my question goes into the research field. I have the feeling from your from what you told us that your methodologies allow for new findings and probably deeper findings that might review some earlier research. How big is your impact into the academic community? And I very much like this idea of slow as resistance. How much can you even impact trends to ask for quick results, KPIs, everything quick, and I don't want to say dirty, but funding institutions may ask for very quick turnaround, high number of publications, etc. So how is your impact within the communities of your peers, and are you able to change a little bit this ever faster trends?
Hi, I'm Mark from European Movement UK, but this is not about the UK. I'm just wondering whether you can ever have too much memory. So, for example, a lot of conflicts are based on memories, true or otherwise, of previous conflicts, whether you're talking about the Balkans in the 20th century, and maybe again, even at the moment where there's a lot of tension, or the conflicts between Western European nations before the European Union came forward. And you could argue that the European Union made the step of forgetting the past, forgetting memories, and looking towards the future, rather than always looking back.
And I saw one question there. I think this is the last one, okay? And
Thank you. Hi, my name's Lorna and I work for COST. So I have the pleasure of being the third logo on there, although not an expert in this at all. We're in Brussels, the city of policy making for the European Union. How do you take this out of the academic sphere? I see the connection very much with the community, but how do you pitch this concept to policymakers? How do you get them to think about the environmental and the migration and the other crises and everything like that, to bring that into what they're doing on a day-to-day basis?
So I leave it up to you. Who wants to take the microphone first and answer at least some of this?
So obviously we haven't got enough time. I mean, so all four things, I mean, I'm sure Jenny has something to say about our impact in the academic community, which would be we only wish we could have a greater impact, because if you read the manifesto, and you clearly haven't, because the last point of the manifesto is no more slow jokes. The manifesto kind of is slightly utopian, I suppose, in the sense that we're trying to encourage a reflection on everything that we think is difficult about what we do in academia, and maybe the impact is going to be slow, and we'll get there in the end. But I can safely say that when we're all together, my job feels a lot better, and if we could extend that out, then that would be great. In terms of, I'm just going to reflect on the policy. I would like to think that through our engagement with stakeholders on the ground, that we can, again, slowly impact those people that are reflecting on policy, and to take all of the opportunities that come along to put our research in front of people that are having the conversations around that. And I know that there are examples within the team where our work is getting there in terms of helping to shape that policy. And it's actually, I know in the case of Northern Ireland, it's actually quite heartening that they are considering academic work, because that's not always been the case, which is the problem. So I'll pass it on to somebody else.
Yeah, I think just to add to this conversation about policy making and the need for research, that policymakers need research, and that the policy should be led by evidence. And I think one of the maybe impact from this project, but also from others who take also policy making that is grounded on the research, but also in the collaboration with communities. And as Chris said at the beginning, that the communities are not brought at the end of that process to validate the data and to validate the policy articulations, but rather to be actors, fully fleshed from the way how we pose questions for the research until the end result of the policy process. And also paying attention to the process itself, what happens. And this requires time, of course, and for very often policy measures are quite fast, and they want policy solutions that are pretty quick fixes, that they follow the logic of quick fixes. And the idea through the slow memory thinking, through slow memory research, is to bring this reflection from the very beginning on throughout the process, and that also in that process each and everyone is equally taken on board to participate, and also is given space for articulation of the policy recommendations, and also as a way of how to imagine the future, not only in terms of a document that would lead to perhaps some policies that never get into action, that they never translate into practice, but also as a platform for definitely making a short-term change, but also giving this space for imagination that is different, is transformative, that leads to transformative politics, and that especially that leaves no one behind.
I was thinking on your question about, what you said about dire needs in the world today also. Maybe it's not that's where we have the strongest impact. I was thinking of the word, we've all learned the word, unfortunately, asymmetric warfare from NATO and, with the Ukraine crisis. And I was thinking of asymmetric academia, that in this case, perhaps there's a need also for new take on issues of dealing with crisis and memory, which involves slowness. So it's a kind of complement to where we maybe are not able to solve the most dire crisis, but we can provide some alternatives of thinking. Thank you.
To pick up on that, to come back to your question, I think one of the things in slow memory that sometimes gets masked by its title is we're not trying to talk in dichotomous terms. It's not necessarily a dichotomy of fast versus slow. We're talking about that events can be polytemporal, they can be fast and slow and medium-paced all at the same time, and addressing that complexity is really important, as is realising that sometimes events are framed as crises, are framed as urgent. That doesn't necessitate definitely a fast solution. Sometimes if you're talking about epistemic justice, for example, standing back and acknowledging that complexity is the most important thing I think you can do.
Well, I would say this brings us slowly but surely to walking through the exhibitions after the drinks. And this relates a lot to the fast decisions, which we want to do and are doing and are forced to do. But being aware and becoming aware every minute of the slow processes. So behind the fast decisions, there are processes which were taking a long time. And even if I have to meet 5 deadlines a day, I need to take a breath and start thinking. And to the impact is very much, again, about education, as Chris was saying, with artificial intelligence and ChatGPT. We really need to move people around us not to take those decisions making by a collection of terms and terminology for granted, but taking the long breath and going through what is out there and what is written. So maybe those dichotomies for us, it doesn't mean that we are slow and making slow decisions. It means we need to take a breath and become aware of it. And that is what matters. Thank you.
I would just very quickly address the question about too much memory, because I'm not sure it has been addressed. Is this on? No. Yes. Okay. So I think the answer is both yes and no. It's a typical academic answer, right? In the sense that, yeah, you're absolutely right. Many conflicts that we see are fueled by memory. And I think, I mean, Kristen and Vjollca both could speak more to this, but sometimes there is a need for a time of not talking about the past. But I think what the slow approach is, particularly what Chris was talking about in his 3 minutes around the kind of agnostic approach and the many voices approach, which can perhaps come in slightly later, post-conflict, is memory, but it's memory done differently. I think it's the nationally focused, nationalistic memory that tends to fuel conflict rather than the kind of slow memories that we're talking about. And I think in terms of academic impact, there's kind of everyday kinds of resistance that we can individually do. And all of the organisers, and I wasn't one of them, of our events, did an amazing job of embedding things like walks and tours and so on into our slow approach. And we can do that. And I see that as a kind of resistance to some of the fast-paced academia as well. And we can do that and still produce outputs and still talk to each other and still have conferences and all the things that we're expected to do. But I'm sure Jenny wants to say more.
I think my colleagues have done a really good job answering the question, so I'm not going to add. I just wanted to say as well, since Lorna's here, I think we've used the cost action in a way, in a somewhat maybe subversive way. Like we're meeting the deliverables, but we also really used it to create space and time. We did a lot of workshops and writing retreats, so we created space to slow down for ourselves and also to work with stakeholders. So it did allow us to do that, and I think it's really important for those of us, once we get into or hopefully get into a position of security, not precarity in academia or wherever job we're working, that we do model that as well, because of course there are always colleagues who can't afford to slow down just yet. And I think we've done a really good job in this project of being really mindful of each other's mental health and restrictions sometimes, right? Sometimes we just couldn't show up because there were kid issues and really doing those practical things makes a difference. So yeah, that's why I love this project and all of these people. And now I will hand over to you, or to Joanna.
Maybe you can explain better what you will.
Yes, so Joanna, the fabulous co-chair of the action.
Thank you so much, Jenny. My name is Joanna Wawrzyniak. Oh, okay, like this. Again? Yeah, okay. My name is Joanna Wawrzyniak. I'm a university professor in Warsaw. I'm both a historian and sociologist, that I did have a pleasure to be a co-chair of this action and also co-lead working group 1 on the memories of work, together with Stefan Berger and Natalie Braber, who is with us. But I'm aware I'm the last one who stands between you and seeing the exhibition, and I just want to make a few general points why exhibitions matter for the action. We've been talking about, the engagement between the scholars and the stakeholders and so on, but I would say that for the memory scholars, research on museums and on exhibitions was one of the main focus of what we do. So kind of following the Finnish president, I have just 3 points. One is that the exhibition do matter for us as part of our research. The second one is that the Slow Memory Project has its own exhibition, and we want to show it to you for a brief moment in a moment, but also exhibitions create a space of the shared encounters and also help us to slow down. So starting with the first point, there are of course many topics you can research as a memory scholars on the exhibitions, but there were a few which were extremely important in the last several years, which really made us aware why the slow memory matters. Those are the topics of slavery, of decolonization, of environment, which we cannot understand without taking into account the long-term perspective. And we did in our project, as you have heard, studied lots of other things like care. Our group did deindustrialization, politics, religion, and so on. But those are the matters of the public discussion right now and were absolutely crucial for what we do. If you follow our website, you will see the output which we do, and then we will also see us as scholars who engage with some of the exhibitions, writing about them and discussing the content. But now let us go to the second point. So we also tried to be curators, and we have with us the bravest curators of all, Vjollca, who was co-leading the team, who tried to change us as scholars to creators and kind of present some teasers of our own research in a form of virtual exhibition. And this is how it starts. So when you click on those flowers, then they open and then they showcase some of our work. In that case, it's part of Lucy and Jessica working group on environment. And then you just need to click on some of those features, and then you will see more about what we did. You will have parts of oral history interviews and other things, which the different working groups were thinking that are interesting as kind of the showcases of what we have done. So now it is my pleasure to go to the very last point, which is the exhibition as space of encounter. Exhibitions are those peculiar places which invite us to slow down in our daily life. We don't need to go to them. They are just. But if we go there, we kind of enter a very different space of imagination and also the encounter with others. And this is what we would like to also propose to you today, because we were in collaboration with Simina, we took her invitation to become the guides to the exhibition and the presence of the past. And Chris is going to explain us how it's going to work. And we are very much inviting you to engage in a conversation with us at the exhibition. Let's go ahead.
So I've been told to tell you that we have to go now and have a drink, which is the good news. But I've also been told to tell you that we are not finished, and it's not a break, as in it's a break, it's not an end. So you are encouraged to go and have a drink. And then after that, we are going to ask you to get yourselves into groups and then go and visit the temporary exhibition, where you will be given the opportunity to engage with some of the activities that we have been working on, which will encourage you to take a slow look at the exhibition. So please go and have a drink, but be aware that we are going to corral you into groups and shepherd you towards the exhibition. And please don't run away. We would very much like to know what you make of these activities. Thank you.